Welcome everybody. Thank you very much for this invitation. I'm very happy to be here and give my thoughts on this very important issue, how to make this social ecological transformation. Many of us here in this room are interested in, have been working on this theoretically or yeah.
Sometimes I hate technology. It's something like a loose complex.
Okay. Okay. So I'll. Yeah. Oh. Yeah. Okay. The socio-ecological transformation, many of you here in the audience have been working theoretically or practically trying to contribute to a resilient society. That's an issue that is urgent, but then you have, and that's the perplexity I was confronted with when working on this presentation. But whenever there apparently seems to pop up an so-called important issue, the Euro crisis, terrorism, whatever, rising unemployment, austerity, green issues seem to be and become secondary. In electoral campaigns, we observe this, and it's difficult to grasp this, being convinced that it should be different. And what I try to present here is a way out of this problematic by presenting some reflections on this concept of the politics of sufficiency. Dirk Holemans started by saying that we have to reduce our resource access by the factor 10. In fact, we are going in totally different direction. We have here a lot of indicators which in fact the loss of rainforest, biodiversity, whatever you look, the water use, there is a not only linear, but sometimes even exponential rise in the use of these resources. And there has been no change over the last years. And that's the perplexity I'm talking about. The second aspect of the perplexity I'm talking about. We have a lot of rhetoric of apparent concern. And the IPCC reports climate change negotiations, but apparently no result. Why and how and what to do in shifting this tendency towards in the direction we are interested. So the problems, to summarize, on the one hand, the continuation of this basic acceleration, and on the other hand, we have the observation, and that's, I think, an important starting point, that power and privileges are not given up very easily. We have a continuation of the dominance of the oil industry. We have a continuation of the car sector dominating our mobility strategies, of the banking sector having huge influence on financial regulations. And that's even aggravated with, let's say, ordinary people's attitude in the richer part of the world to try to stick to this type of lifestyle we have been used to, and which has a lot of positive aspects, besides being unsustainable. So over the last years, I've been participating, and many of us in different networks, and I have the impression that there is something like a movement, and it has been described as a search and learning movement that in different aspects tries in transnational configurations to deal with this challenge. The degrowth conference, which was a huge success last year in Leipzig, attracted a lot of people, will be continued in Budapest. We had a Good Life for All Congress with a broader audience, because it also included political institutions and trade unions, something missing in the degrowth conference. And then we have this, by Dirk Holemans presented, ECOPRO project, which is organizing this event, and is also a transnational green activity. And when you participate in these networks, you perceive there is a rich repertoire of experiences showing that an alternative is possible. In very practical ways, examples, grassroots activities. So this gives hope. That's a very important starting point. Well, I will, and then there is a second aspect which is also very positive. Over the last years, there is an increasing consensus by important thinkers in the field of social and ecological transformation. You can have approaches by Tim Jackson, of prosperity without growth, by Nico Pech, who I think was also invited here to Belgium, with his reflections on and criticism of excess, and his approach towards a post-growth society. Harald Welzer, who explicitly assumes that the transformation is inevitable. The challenge is that it will happen not by disaster but by design. So how can we organize a society that is shrinking in a way that all the achievements of modernity are taken into account? So he talks about a reductive modernity. The positive side of modernity, we, like human rights, democracy, and social rights, we try to maintain, while we abandon this inherently expansionary tendency of our capitalist market societies. Uwe Schneidewind, who comes from the Wuppertal Institute, which is famous for the efficiency revolution, the factor 10 approach, that technology will solve the ecological problems. And he, as following von Weizsäcker as head of this institution, he kind of added, saying, okay, technology is important, we should not neglect the potential of technology, but besides this, we need a sufficiency revolution. We need to change our lifestyle. We need to approach prosperity in a different way, quite in line with what Tim Jackson said. And finally, a few days ago, the Germans published a book on the critique of the green economy, something interesting, exactly because it was published in Germany and by the Heinrich Böll Foundation, where this critique is also an indication that there is a change in attitude towards the green economy. So you have a certain consensus that there is a necessity of, again, embedding the economy in society. And something that an Austro-Hungarian thinker, Karl Polony, elaborated, worked on in the last century, and in his reflections on the Great Depression in the 1930s, war and fascism, he came to the conviction that freedom for all, and he still was not talking about the ecological challenges, freedom for all requires subordinating the economic calculus and the economic logic under societal and political concerns. And Karl Polanyi gained I think a lot of people, like myself, started to reread Karl Polanyi after the financial crisis in 2008, because what he did was a reflection of the failure of what today is called market fundamentalism. So I reread it under this perception, and it's a very interesting, inspiring book criticizing market fundamentalism. But it's more than this, and I will show you that for our concrete issues, the idea of an embedded economy is of crucial importance, and it has certain implications for the focus that we should have with respect to our sufficiency strategies. And the consensus that I mentioned, the emerging consensus, is not a minor, not a compromise around minor issues, but really, I would say, a substantial approach towards a new civilizational model. It's based on slower, less, better, and finer. So the idea that shrinking can be something positive. Shrinking can imply gaining quality. Less cars in the city can mean more freedom for children and for leisure activities. It implies, and that's not trivial at all, going beyond consumerism. It's good thinking towards fair consumption, regionalized consumption, but we have to be aware that civilizationally we should regain an understanding that needs can be satisfied in another way than only consumption. By doing it yourself, by having an infrastructure that makes it available without buying things, having things. It implies, and that's the critique of the green growth paradigm, going beyond the growth imperative. Maybe, and for sure, parts of the economy will continue growing, but it should not be this necessity grow or being extinct from the market, which rules the economic system. And it should be a democratically designed way of how we want to live and organize our society. And when Polony in 1944, in the Great Transformation in this book, looked back towards the transformation from an agrarian society to industrial society, he said the transformation of this system, the market society of the 19th century, from the earlier economy, the agrarian feudal society, is so complete that it resembles more the metamorphosis of the caterpillar to a butterfly than any alteration that can be expressed in terms of continuous growth and development. And that's important when we talk about the transition we are currently in. There was that term transformation refers to these three great changes in human civilization, from hunters to peasants, from the agrarian society to the industrial society, and apparently something as fundamental is underway currently, and that's called, let's call it a sustainability revolution. But when you look at the authors who promote this approach, and there are quite a lot of people in this line of reasoning, then we have to pose this question, whether it is reasonable to assume that such a huge transformation will be achieved without fundamentally different way of living, producing, organizing our life. And I think, and that's the Polanyian argument, no, we will have to look for different institutions, for different relationships, and a different relationship also to society. And that's, I would say, the Polanyian challenge that we are faced, and that's the learning and searching movement that I referred to. And the attitude of this movement is we don't know the answer, we don't know how this other society will look like, but we are realistic automatically assuming that it will be very different. So we have to experiment with a lot of local experiments, trying to look how a circular regional economy functions, how a sharing economy can be organized, how how the food system can be localized, regionalized. I took this one because CO2 emission is kind of in the community got some decisive element or status more than biodiversity, etc. You could use others, but you see that, as I said at the beginning, nothing changed with the concern and the negotiations and the discussions and the introduction of all kinds of fine-looking market mechanisms like emission trading, etc., over the last years with respect to the outcome, the material effect. And that leads, and I am one of the persons who is quite skeptical with respect to the outcome of this climate conference, because obviously, once again, other logics seem to be more important than saving the climate, which is an issue apparently for the long run. So when you have this approach or this perception that also the ecological movement thinks globally, this has a depressive connotation very often, but then you perceive the acceleration doesn't stop, etc. So concentrate on local alternatives, act locally. That's a green approach, and that's a correct approach. But the consensus which has emerged, and that unites most of the persons that I've mentioned before, is that that's not sufficient. Very often these local best practice alternatives, they remain trapped in niches. That's the danger, that the Fairphone is something nice for a few people who are willing to support this type of product, but it does not get the normal way how our mobile phone industry is organized. And the challenge is therefore, and we call this bottom-linked transformation and initiatives, how to have these grassroots alternatives, innovations from the bottom up. How can we organize this in a way that it gets really substantially and systemic, and thereby having an impact on the material results? And in our conference in Vienna, we kind of summarized this challenge. A repair cafe, a fab lab, a very good innovation, a very good approach, but the challenge is to transform this into a cradle-to-cradle economy. A food cooperative, very popular with my students in Vienna. Half of the students are involved in one or the other type of food cooperative. How to go forward one step from this localized small initiative to another type of organizing the local, the regional food system, organically regionalized. The same with the car sharing project and the low carbon city. So the focus, that's the consensus, is that we should shift the focus from the best practice projects to the concern for infrastructures necessary to mainstream these alternatives, to other institutions, legal frameworks that prohibit that Apple kind of impedes the repair of their products, and attempts at regionalization, which we are dealing here in this conference more specifically. So that's the first point, and I think that's a very important step forward from the best practice approach, presenting cases that are successful, to the concern, what do these cases need to become effective and more broader and general. And I will now, in the second part of the presentation, I will focus on the second step forward, and that's now again taking Polony and his specific concerns. And when I, in 2015, looked again at the Great Transformation and at this really inspiring text, which I highly recommend to you reading, then I perceived that the deep ethical concern of Polony, writing in 44, and of John Maynard Keynes, where when I looked again in the General Theory, written in 1936, was not that much with the perfect economic system. The concern was with social development and peace. And reading this in 2015 kind of shifts, gets another importance, and I didn't read it in 2008 because I read it from the financial market perspective. But the challenge that is posed for our economic system going in the wrong direction is how can we organize this differently to avoid that these destructive forces of fascism in the case of the 1940s and war can be avoided. So that's the second challenge, and in this sense, these key ideas that economics has to serve society, that politics and democratic decision making has to gain again in importance with respect to economic self-regulating dynamics is a key issue. So what did I will skip. I will be very quick with this. Reading Polony and the argument he exposed was not so much, he kind of constated that market fundamentalism doesn't work. A little bit the same as Stiglitz and many others are saying today, criticizing this economic approach. But in fact, he goes a step further and saying that it fails, but the danger is that the failure of this liberal utopia leads to something perhaps even worse. There is a reactionary movement against this market failure, which is anti-liberal, anti-democratic, and racist. And the failure of the economic system has horrible effects on society in general. And in this year in Austria, we had some regional elections, and the extreme right-wing party tremendously increased in votes. And all of you know the attitudes with respect to refugees and to migrants, etc. But the interesting thing is that they had increasingly a very clear position with respect to ecological issues and climate change. There is more or less an open climate change denying attitude and a very deliberate strategy of saying that the ecological, the environmental policies proposed are much too ambitious, they are utopian, they are dangerous for Austrian industry. And it was, in fact, unfortunately, the alliance between regional industry and this right-wing party, which resulted in a change in the regional government. So what is the unifying approach or the unifying attitude that we have to take serious of this right-wing ideology? The approach is we here in the rich Western countries, we must not change. Our lifestyle will be maintained. This idea, and that is very attractive. And it is a social and an ecological promise. If there is lack of oil, we have the military and organize it from wherever necessary. If there are too many migrants coming, we will create a fortress avoiding that they enter. That is the attractive program and vision offered by them. The challenge is the boat is full. The The challenge is how to organize a social and ecological alternative. And what I propose, and I started with saying that it's an urgent issue, I think we have to be aware that what is happening in the ecological sphere is strongly related to others. And our struggle in for a different lifestyle, the attractiveness of a cooperative way of solving problems, the attractiveness of a more resilient economic system is not only in the long run a climate change necessity, but it is a short-term necessity of opposing these tendencies of putting one part of the population against the others, countries against countries. And in this sense, we have to broaden the question. So far, we, in the different contexts I've been involved, always discussed how to organize the social ecological transformation. And I think we have to add to it in a peaceful way. Harald Welzer, as I said transformation by design or by disaster. One can add moving towards a society where the selected few or where all people can have a decent life. And there is a very clear idea in the Tea Party, in right-wing parties in other parts of the world, if it's sufficient that we maintain our lifestyle. What's going on in the rest of the world is they will take care of themselves. The alternative that we are proposing is that we have a lifestyle here which allows us a decent life, but not at the cost of other parts of the world, which implies, and that's what we are seeing, which implies very high cost also for us. We cannot, and that's the illusion of the right-wing parties, we cannot create a fortress Europe. Other people will enter, friendly and not friendly ones. And we cannot create walls around Europe to avoid that climate change happens. We are part of this planet, and therefore we are affected by what is going on. And in this sense, I argue in favor of broadening the perspective. Sustainability, peace, and justice are strongly related. And this shows, and this gives much more importance and relevance to all the cases which we will hear afterwards. Their concern is not only a concern for a different type of economic activity, it is a concern for a different way of organizing our lives, our production system, and our relation to the rest of the world. And the key point, and that's the last, that's what I call the necessary second step, and that's not consensus, that's not the key focus in the discussions of Jackson, Welzer, Pech, and others, is that, in my understanding, and that's Polony's point of view, that's Keynes' point of view in the 1930s and 1940s, that this cannot go hand in hand with this uncontrolled economic globalization. Because economic globalization, political cooperation at the international level, cultural diversity does not go hand in hand. The harmful aspects of economic globalization is that it unavoidable is the dominant system. And by becoming global, it subordinates the other system to its own logic. And therefore, it's so important that this logic is broken. And I think all these positive aspects of bottom-linked transformations, of grassroots transformations, and their relationship with institutional change, which is a necessary first step, this could get a totally different dynamic, much more dynamic, much more positive, much broader, if the global setting is more favorable, and that's, in other words, if the impeding dynamics of economic globalization are limited. And I'm arguing in favor of a coordinated economic deglobalization, because in the 1930s, one of the results of market fundamentalism was economic war and uncoordinated deglobalization. Before the military war started, there was protectionism, competition between these small European nation states, deepening the crisis. There was the German approach towards accessing resources, etc., etc. So there was already deglobalization, and we observe currently deglobalization. The relationship between the sanctions between Russia and the European Union, the relationship to the Near East. There are tendencies of weakening economic globalization, but in an uncoordinated way, in a destructive way, and it would be necessary and much more recommendable to do this in a coordinated way under the logic of socio-ecological transformation. And what I present here, again, is in large part not that unknown. It's not very radical, but it's simply not happening. And here again, we are with the issue of power of privilege. There, we are 7 years after the financial crisis, but there are still a lot of tax havens in Europe. There are still not that strict regulation of the financial markets. The idea that a regional circular economy would be incentivated by increasing transport costs is an additional element which there is common agreement with respect to. That we need, with all these concerns of organizing the worldwide economic system, there are the advancements of socio-ecological regulations, worldwide binding ones, is very elementary. Binding are economic regulations favoring large corporations. Not binding are labor regulation, environmental regulations, etc. This has to be turned around. No TTIP. And then, because that's a few months ago, sustainable development goals, a very good idea in kind of steps towards the good life for all, but they are not binding. So deglobalization in the economic sphere would allow, would permit, and should go hand in hand with another type of globalization in other spheres of the society. And this would allow to rethink the regional, the spatial order of the economic system. And the New Economics Foundation in 2010 published a report on the Great Transition, how they called it. And the interesting thing is, and what they did in this table is to look at what is the minimum size for a reasonable, efficient, productive system. And you see that there are certain products which don't need a large market, like micro energy renewables or cash crop access to fresh fruits. And then there is a huge a range of activities which could be organized in a regional scale of, they call this 2 million inhabitants. And I agree that the regional scale is a very interesting unit for social and ecological, for a social ecological productive system. whereas there are not that many products where economies of scale require larger markets than 2 million. Closest textile, electronic devices, large aircrafts are mentioned in this report. So I think there is a huge potential which could be used, and I will close at that point because I've been reminded that I've come to the limit of my 30 minutes. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions.